The chandeliers of the Langford Hotel ballroom glittered like constellations trapped in glass, their light bouncing off champagne flutes and sequined gowns. Music from the string quartet floated through the air, refined and restrained, meant to underscore celebration. 200 guests had gathered, dressed in gowns and tuxedos, to mark the 5th anniversary of Adrian and Serena Blackwell's marriage. Waiters in white gloves weaved between the clusters of Atlanta's wealthiest families, pouring Dom Perignon into crystal. Every camera lens, every whispered conversation, every practiced smile was aimed toward the couple who, at least until tonight, embodied the image of perfection. Adrian Blackwell, 34, commanded the center of the room, as if the marble floors themselves had been laid to display him. Tall, impeccably tailored in a midnight suit, his confidence radiated like the sharp edge of a blade. He had built his fortune from a tech empire that swallowed competitors whole, and his reputation was just as ruthless. People didn't attend the gala to honor his love for Serena. They came because being in Adrian Blackwell's orbit promised opportunities, contracts, investments. Serena stood a step behind him, draped in an emerald gown that shimmered like a river beneath moonlight. At 29, her beauty was soft yet striking, the kind that didn't scream but compelled silence. She greeted guests with a warmth that Adrian never bothered with, her presence smoothing the edges of his arrogance. But tonight, Adrian hadn't invited them here to celebrate her. Tonight, she was meant to be collateral. The clinking of glass drew attention as Adrian stepped onto the small stage near the orchestra. He raised his champagne flute, his smile polished to perfection. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned. Serena, still by his side, set down her untouched drink and folded her hands, her posture serene. She had no inkling, not truly, of what was coming. At least that's what Adrian believed. Friends, partners, family, Adrian began, his voice carrying that magnetic timbre that had sold billions in stock and charmed boardrooms into obedience. We are gathered here tonight for a celebration, but not the one you expect. A ripple of unease whispered across the crowd. Serena's parents exchanged quick glances at their table. The orchestra faltered for half a note before recovering. Adrian gestured toward the double doors of the ballroom, which opened as though on cue. In swept Vivian Hart, platinum blonde, tall, the kind of beauty that thrived in camera flashes. She wore crimson silk that clung to her like molten fire, the color deliberately chosen to rival Serena's emerald. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the room. Adrian reached for Vivian's hand, pulling her forward with a flourish. "This," he declared, "is the woman I love. Vivian is my future. I will no longer pretend, no longer hide. Tonight, I announce that my marriage to Serena is over." The silence that followed was deafening. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. Serena's mother raised a trembling hand to her pearls. Her father sat rigid, fury contained by decades of courtroom discipline. A few of Adrian's business partners nodded approvingly, already calculating which alliances to maintain. Others looked away, uncomfortable witnesses to a public execution. Serena did not move. For a moment it seemed she had turned to stone, the embodiment of shock. Adrian waited for tears, for her collapse, for the scene that would prove his superiority. He wanted her humiliation to be absolute, her image shattered beyond repair, so he could parade Vivian without consequence. He expected pleading, anger, maybe even collapse. Instead, Serena smiled. It began faintly, the barest curve at the corner of her lips, but it grew with deliberate grace. It wasn't the brittle smile of someone covering wounds. It was calm, knowing, and sharp enough to slice through the room's tension, the kind of smile that turned silence into spectacle. Gasps rippled again, not at Adrian's declaration, but at Serena's response. A whisper ran through the crowd. Why is she smiling? The photographers, always hungry for drama, snapped feverishly, capturing her serenity beside his arrogance. Adrian's throat tightened. The victory he had imagined, Serena broken, begging, defeated, evaporated in an instant. Instead of looking destroyed, she looked untouchable. The smile unsettled him in a way no competitor, no lawsuit, no hostile takeover ever had. It wasn't submission, it was something else entirely. Serena inclined her head, acknowledging the crowd as if this betrayal were nothing more than a mildly inconvenient interruption to her evening. Then, softly, almost tenderly, she raised her glass, though she hadn't taken a sip. "To the future," she said, her voice smooth, carrying effortlessly across the marble and velvet. Her smile lingered, and in that moment, every person in the ballroom sensed it. Adrian Blackwell hadn't ended his marriage, he had just declared war on a woman who refused to break. The news spread faster than wildfire could touch dry grass. By morning, every tabloid in the city had Serena's face on its front page. Not Adrian, not Vivian. It was her smile that gripped the world. Headlines called it haunting, others called it dangerous. A few even called it divine. The betrayed wife who didn't cry, the woman who didn't break. The mystery behind that calm curve of her lips was now the story. Adrian had expected sympathy. He thought the media would paint him as decisive, bold, a man who took what he wanted without apology. Instead, every article asked the same question: what does Serena know that we don't? Adrian sat in his penthouse office overlooking the skyline, phone buzzing with calls he had no interest in taking. Investors wanted reassurance, partners wanted statements. Even his own board demanded to know why their stock had dipped 3% overnight. He brushed them off, certain the frenzy would die within a week. What he did not admit, not even to himself, was that the image of her smile kept replaying in his mind. Not tender, not mocking, something else entirely. It was the expression of someone who had already written the ending while he was still performing the prologue. Serena, meanwhile, did not hide. She walked through the city as though the betrayal were nothing more than a passing storm. She went to her favorite cafe, sat in the corner reading a book while whispers and stares followed her. Strangers stopped her in grocery stores to offer condolences, but she only smiled again, calm and unbothered. That smile unsettled even the well-meaning. It suggested she was holding a secret too powerful for pity. At night, in her quiet townhouse on the edge of the city, Serena opened a leather-bound journal. Inside were pages of neat handwriting and clipped documents. Receipts, emails, notes from overheard calls Adrian thought she had ignored. She traced her fingers over the pages like a pianist rehearsing before a performance. For 2 years, she had been collecting. For 2 years, she had smiled politely at dinners while Adrian grew arrogant. Now she had everything she needed. Vivian basked in her new spotlight, uploading photos of diamond bracelets, of champagne breakfasts with Adrian. She captioned them with sugary words meant to sting Serena, but every post only drew comments about Serena's smile. Thousands of people dissected it online, some calling it revenge, others sian, calling it strategy. Vivian grew restless, realizing she had won the man, but lost the narrative. Adrian tried to ignore it, but the cracks widened. His banker called to warn him that a quiet inquiry had begun into offshore accounts. A journalist emailed questions about old contracts. An employee sent an anonymous tip to regulators. Adrian cursed, assuming it was coincidence, but deep down, beneath layers of ego, he wondered if it was connected. Late one evening, he poured a glass of whiskey and stared at his reflection. For the first time, he questioned whether humiliating Serena had been a mistake. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't begged, she hadn't broken, she had smiled. And now, that smile was unraveling everything he thought was under his control. The city no longer whispered about Adrian Blackwell, the ruthless millionaire who replaced his wife with a mistress. The city whispered about Serena Blackwell, the woman who smiled back. And in the quiet of his penthouse, Adrian realized something chilling. The war he thought he had started might never have been his to begin with. The morning sun spilled through tall windows in Serena's townhouse, painting golden patterns across the floor. She sat at the table with a cup of black coffee, the steam rising in soft curls, her journal open before her. She had filled it with more than memories. Inside were photographs, clipped emails, numbers written in precise ink, and notes that looked like fragments of a puzzle only she could solve. Adrian had never cared about her notebooks. To him, Serena was beauty to place on his arm at events, elegance to soften his arrogance in boardrooms. He never asked why she stayed up late reading case studies, or why her grandmother's stories fascinated her more than designer gowns. He had missed the truth. Serena was the granddaughter of Evelyn Sterling, a woman who had built her fortune in the cosmetics world during a time when women weren't supposed to own anything at all. Evelyn had too. Taught Serena that betrayal was inevitable, but so was opportunity, if you knew how to wait for it. Roses bloom best, her grandmother always said, when they grow through concrete. Serena remembered the nights when Adrian came home late, smelling of cologne that wasn't his own. She had smiled then too, not because she was blind, but because she was watching, recording, storing. She had taken photographs of receipts left carelessly in his jackets, transferred files from his laptop when he fell asleep. She had not confronted him because storms are not stopped by shouting at the clouds. They are survived by building shelter. Now that shelter was complete, her phone buzzed. It was Amira, her childhood friend who had become a lawyer feared in Atlanta's wealthiest circles. They met at a quiet cafe where Serena slid the journal across the table. Amira flipped through the pages, her sharp eyes widening at each detail. Offshore accounts under false names, payments to silence employees, contracts with clauses that could topple Adrian's empire if made public. "You've been building this for years," Amira whispered. "I knew who he was before he thought I did," Serena replied calmly. "He believed I was just decoration, but while he was rehearsing his betrayal, I was preparing mine." Suspense tightened around her like an invisible cloak. She had allies Adrian never knew existed. Former employees who had trusted her kindness more than his cruelty. Journalists waiting for proof to confirm suspicions. Even members of Adrian's own board who had longed for someone brave enough to confront him. Across the city, Adrian sat in his tower office, unaware of how close the ground beneath him was beginning to crack. He believed the smile had been a trick of the moment, a mask she wore to save face. He did not yet realize it was a signal, a warning. Vivian continued her charade online, posty, diamond-studded mornings and silk-sheeted nights. But Serena's image dominated every headline. At luncheons and charity events, whispers grew. Who was Serena really? Why did she look so calm? What was she planning? That evening, Serena stood by her window overlooking the city lights. In the glass, she saw both her reflection and her grandmother's ghost, strong and unyielding. She whispered softly, as if Evelyn could still hear. "It's time." The war Adrian thought he had begun was already 3 moves behind. The wife he had discarded was not preparing to survive. She was preparing to conquer. Vivian draped herself across the velvet chaise in the Blackwell mansion as though she had conquered a kingdom. The marble floors gleamed under her stilettos, chandeliers sparkled above her head, and Adrian's initials embroidered on silk pillows seemed to whisper proof of her victory. She filmed short videos for her followers, flashing diamond bracelets Adrian had purchased only days earlier. She posed with wine and crystal glasses, captioning her posts with phrases meant to cut into Serena's pride. But what Vivian didn't see, what she couldn't feel, was that every image she uploaded only magnified Serena's presence. The world wasn't laughing at Serena's fall. They were watching, waiting, wondering why the woman scorned still smiled. Vivian gained likes, but Serena gathered power. Adrian paraded Vivian through restaurants, galleries, even corporate events where investors watched with forced politeness. He thought flaunting his mistress made him appear bold and untouchable. What he didn't notice was the shifting glances across the room. Partners whispered in corners, clients hesitated before shaking his hand. There was no admiration in their eyes, only calculation. The foundation of loyalty that once held his empire steady had begun to fracture. At one gala, while Vivian shimmered in a gold gown meant to blind the room, Serena appeared unexpectedly. She wore a dress of deep sapphire blue, elegant and understated, yet it turned heads the moment she walked in. Conversations stilled. The orchestra played softer as if recognizing a new rhythm in the air. Serena did not avoid them. She walked directly to Adrian and Vivian, her smile as calm as the night of the betrayal. She leaned in, kissed Vivian lightly on the cheek, and greeted Adrian with the poise of a queen acknowledging her subjects. Cameras flashed like lightning. The images would be on every front page by morning. Vivian's confident laughter faltered, her grip tightening on Adrian's arm. She whispered later that night, her voice edged with fear. "She's haunting us. That smile is everywhere. People look at her like she's royalty, and me like I'm just a placeholder." Adrian dismissed her insecurities, but his own mind kept returning to the ballroom, to the way the crowd shifted toward Serena as though she carried gravity. He had expected her to fade into silence. Instead, she was more present than ever, her elegance casting shadows over his supposed triumph. Meanwhile, Serena was moving quietly through society. She attended luncheons, not to mourn, but to listen. She sat with wives of Adrian's partners, with board members' daughters, with women who had long endured the arrogance of men like Adrian. Her calm, her dignity, her refusal to play the victim turned whispers into admiration. Invitations multiplied. Journalists requested interviews. She politely declined, letting silence speak louder than words. Every move Vivian made to flaunt her new position only deepened the contrast. Serena was mystery. Serena was poise. Serena was the story. By the time Adrian realized it, it was too late. He had placed Vivian on a throne made of glass, and with every smile Serena offered, tiny cracks spread across its surface. It would not shatter today or tomorrow, but when it did, the fall would be heard across the entire city. The charity auction at the Rosemont Hall was supposed to be Adrian's night of redemption. He had donated a small fortune, bought out an entire table for himself and Vivian, and instructed the press to capture his new beginning. The room glowed with candlelight, champagne sparkled in crystal, and society's finest gathered to be seen. Adrian walked in with Vivian on his arm, convinced this event would silence whispers and prove that he had traded up. But the moment Serena entered, the air shifted. She wore white satin, a color usually reserved for brides, but on her it carried a sharper meaning. Her presence was neither bitter nor broken. It was luminous, commanding, almost untouchable. Conversations faltered, cameras swung. For every glance Vivian tried to hold, 10 more turned toward Serena. The auctioneer began his announcements, but the true bidding war was silent, playing out in stares and whispers. Serena sat near the front, across from Adrian's table, every movement deliberate. She didn't need diamonds or noise. She let silence speak, and the silence screamed louder than Vivian's laughter. Halfway through the evening, the auctioneer presented the night's prize, a rare painting by a forgotten female artist whose work had recently gained attention. Adrian raised his paddle, certain he would win. He wanted to show his wealth, to claim victory in front of Serena. The bidding climbed higher, murmurs rippled across the room, and Adrian smirked when the number reached 2 million. No one would dare outbid him. Then Serena lifted her paddle. Calm, steady. The crowd gasped. Adrian's smirk faltered. She raised again, and again. Her expression never changed. By the time the bidding closed, she had secured the painting for a price that made even the wealthiest guests shift in astonishment. The auctioneer announced her name, his voice echoing. "Sold to Mrs. Serena, Blackwell." Applause erupted, genuine and warm, directed not at Adrian or his mistress, but at the woman he had tried to cast aside. Vivian's cheeks burned. She whispered harshly to Adrian, "Do something. She's making us look like fools." Adrian clenched his jaw, rage tightening his body, but he could do nothing. Serena's smile lingered, a weapon more powerful than any dagger. After the event, reporters swarmed outside. Adrian had arranged for questions about his donation, about his future with Vivian, but every microphone turned toward Serena instead. They asked about her purchase, her plans, her thoughts. She answered little, only offering her calm smile and one sentence that made the headlines by morning. Some art deserves to be preserved, no matter how long it was overlooked. The words weren't about the painting. Everyone knew it. They were about her. By the next day, society pages brimmed with photographs of Serena radiant in white, while Vivian stood in the background looking small, almost invisible. Investors called Adrian demanding answers, not about business, but about his judgment. And in the quiet of his penthouse, Adrian finally understood the truth he had been avoiding. Serena wasn't just surviving, she was winning, and he was running out of moves. Rain slicked across the city the night Adrian felt his empire tremble for the first time. He stood in his office tower, staring out at the streets below, where headlights blurred like streaks of silver. Vivian lounged behind him on a leather sofa, scrolling through her phone, muttering about her declining followers. Adrian barely listened. His mind was trapped in the calls he had received that afternoon. A government regulator asking questions about one of his contracts, a banker hinting at irregularities in his accounts, and worst of all, a journalist requesting comment on documents only Serena could have known existed. He poured whiskey into crystal, the amber liquid shaking in his hand. He told himself it was coincidence, the kind of pressure any powerful man faced. But he could not shake the image of Serena at the auction, calm as a chess master moving pawns into place. Across town, Serena sat in her townhouse surrounded by quiet. Amira, her lawyer, laid folders across the dining table. Inside were records of Adrian's hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell companies registered under false names, contracts signed with promises that bent the law until it nearly snapped. Serena touched each page as though they were instruments in an orchestra, waiting for the perfect moment to begin the music. "Are you ready for the first strike?" Amira asked. Serena's smile was small, precise. "Tonight." The storm outside matched the storm she had prepared for years. She sent a single message from her phone to a journalist who had been waiting for proof. No explanation, no words, just a file attached. By morning, it would be a headline. Meanwhile, Adrian tried to distract himself with Vivian's chatter, but her voice was grating, shallow. She waved her phone in his face, demanding he deal with Serena's growing influence online. "She doesn't even post, and yet she's trending more than me. Do something, Adrian. Make her disappear." Her demand echoed louder than the storm. Make her disappear. It was what Adrian had tried to do the night of the gala, when he replaced his wife in front of the world. But instead of vanishing, Serena had grown larger than both of them combined. At dawn, Adrian's phone buzzed violently. He answered, only to hear the voice of his lawyer thick with anger. "The Times has your Cayman accounts. It's front page. Anonymous sources are already feeding regulators. If you don't act now, you'll be finished." Adrian's glass slipped from his hand and shattered against marble. He turned toward Vivian, who sat scrolling through gossip blogs, oblivious to the storm building around them. He realized with a sinking weight that Serena hadn't just smiled back. She had smiled because she had already chosen the battlefield, and it was one he could not control. Across the city, Serena closed her journal and watched the sunrise paint the sky in fire and gold. The first strike had landed. Adrian still believed this was a war of reputation, but she knew better. This was a war of survival, and she had only just begun. The city woke to chaos. Newsstands sold out before noon. Television anchors repeated the same headline, and Adrian's name burned across every channel. Offshore accounts, shell companies, shady contracts. The man who had once been celebrated as a self-made millionaire was now painted as a fraud in a tailored suit. Cameras camped outside his office tower, capturing every shadow that moved past the glass. Adrian stormed into a board meeting, his jaw clenched, his suit immaculate but hiding the cracks beneath. He slammed the newspaper down in front of his directors, the ink still wet. "Lies," he barked. "Fabricated trash designed to humiliate me." But the room was silent. Some shifted uncomfortably, others avoided his gaze. Finally, one voice broke the silence. "Lies don't usually come with account numbers and transaction dates." The words hung heavy. For the first time, Adrian realized his empire was no longer entirely his. Doubt had seeped into the walls. That night, desperate to claw back control, he staged a press conference. Vivian stood beside him in a shimmering gown, smiling too brightly for the cameras. Adrian declared himself the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by his jealous ex-wife. He painted Serena as bitter, unstable, obsessed with revenge. The cameras flashed, the microphones caught every syllable, and Adrian left too. He staged certain he had regained some ground, but Serena had been waiting. Hours later, as the city buzzed with Adrian's accusations, she appeared not in a press hall, but in a quiet university auditorium. She had accepted an invitation to speak at a seminar on women in business. The cameras followed her there too, drawn by the pull of her mystery. She stood at the podium in simple black, no jewels, no glitter, only quiet strength. She spoke not of Adrian or betrayal, but of resilience, of what it meant to be underestimated, of how silence was not weakness, but strategy. The audience listened as though her words were fire, and when she finished, she offered that same smile, the one that had haunted Adrian since the night of his gala. Cameras captured it, and by morning, every outlet carried a split image. Adrian, defensive and angry; Serena, calm and unshaken. Behind the scenes, her strikes cut deeper. A recording surfaced, leaked to a journalist. Adrian's voice, sharp and careless, discussing how he had bribed a city official to secure permits for one of his projects. The leak spread like gasoline to fire. Investors pulled out. Regulators announced investigations. Vivian panicked. Her glamorous world shrank overnight as sponsors dropped her, followers mocked her, and whispers painted her as nothing more than a prop in Adrian's crumbling empire. She screamed at Adrian, accused him of ruining her, but he barely heard her. All he could see was Serena's face on every screen, smiling as though she had already won. Adrian finally understood the truth. He had thought Serena's silence was surrender. It wasn't. It was patience. She had waited until the world was watching, until every eye was on him, and then she had pulled the floor out from under his empire. And still, she hadn't raised her voice. Adrian was a man cornered, and he knew it. Every morning brought new headlines, each sharper than the last. Bankers who once begged for his attention now ignored his calls. Partners distanced themselves with carefully worded statements. Even his own board whispered about replacement. But what broke him most was the sound of Serena's name carried on everyone's lips, not as a victim, not as a forgotten wife, but as a symbol, calm, composed, untouchable. Desperation breeds recklessness. Adrian decided he would strike back where Serena least expected. He summoned his most ruthless attorneys, ordered them to prepare a lawsuit accusing her of defamation, fraud, even theft of confidential documents. His plan was simple. If he could not silence her reputation, he would drown it in the noise of legal war. But Serena had already moved 3 steps ahead. The night Adrian announced his lawsuit, Serena hosted a small gathering at a private gallery downtown. Only 100 guests, but each one carefully chosen. Journalists with pens like swords, investors tired of Adrian's arrogance, women whose voices had been silenced in boardrooms. She walked them through the gallery walls lined not with paintings but with photographs, receipts, emails, contracts, every piece of proof Adrian had once hidden. When whispers rose, Serena only smiled. "Truth," she said softly, "is not fragile. It only feels dangerous to those who have built their lives on lies." Cameras captured every word. By the time Adrian's lawsuit hit the morning papers, the gallery images had already gone viral. The lawsuit looked less like a weapon and more like a confession. But what Adrian didn't know, what made his stomach turn when he found out, was that Serena was no longer fighting alone. Behind her quiet poise stood allies he had underestimated. Amira, her lawyer, had assembled a coalition of women in finance and law, many of them wives Adrian had once brushed aside at dinners. One of his own former executives had stepped forward, roveting documents in exchange for Serena's promise of protection. And hidden in the shadows were men who had lost everything to Adrian's greed, now eager to watch him burn. The first hearing arrived faster than Adrian expected. He entered the courthouse dressed in steel-gray confidence, Vivian trailing behind him in silence, her once shining aura dulled by fear. But when he saw the other side of the courtroom, his heart clenched. Serena sat at the table with Amira, but she was not alone. Behind her were women he recognized from charity boards, from investors' circles, from rival firms. Their eyes weren't on Amira or the judge. They were on Serena. She had become something larger than one woman's story. She had become the gathering point of everyone Adrian had ever underestimated. The judge reviewed the lawsuit, flipping through the accusations Adrian's lawyers had so carefully written. Then he looked up. "Mr. Blackwell, this filing reads less like a case and more like retaliation. I strongly suggest you reconsider before wasting this court's time further." Gasps rippled across the room. Adrian clenched his fists under the table, rage boiling, but when he looked up, Serena's eyes were waiting for him, calm, steady, that same smile that had started it all. For the first time, Adrian felt something colder than defeat. He felt irrelevance. The war he thought he controlled was no longer his to fight. It belonged to Serena now, and to the army of allies she had quietly gathered in the shadows. Adrian Blackwell had always thrived on control, but as autumn settled over the city, he realized his grip was slipping through his fingers like sand. The regulators circled closer, the banks tightened their leash, and Vivian no longer played the role of radiant mistress. She had grown restless, bitter, snapping at him in private and sulking in public. His once golden empire now trembled on foundations that Serena had cracked with nothing more than patience and precision. But Adrian still had one card left. A desperate gamble whispered to him in Slee, "Epless nights." If Serena wanted to play the role of savior, then he would expose her as the villain. He ordered his investigators to dig, to search every inch of her life for something, anything, that could be twisted into a weapon. Weeks passed with little more than gossip, until one night, his investigator slid a folder across his desk. Inside was a revelation that made Adrian smile for the first time in months. The documents showed Serena had quietly purchased shares of his company months before the gala betrayal, using a discreet trust under her grandmother's name. On paper it looked deliberate, as though she had planned his destruction long before he introduced Vivian to the world. Adrian's mind raced. If he revealed this, he could paint her as the mastermind behind everything. Not the betrayed wife, but the calculating woman who schemed to steal his empire. He wasted no time. At a high-profile business conference, with reporters filling every corner, Adrian stepped onto the stage. His voice carried the arrogance of a man trying to resurrect his throne. He presented the documents on a giant screen, declaring that Serena's entire campaign was a fraud. "She has deceived you all," he thundered. "She manipulated me, manipulated this city, and manipulated every one of you. This was never about truth. It was about power." Gasps filled the room. Cameras flashed. Adrian felt a rush of triumph. At last, he thought, he had turned the tide. But then a sound echoed from the back of the hall. Applause. Slow, deliberate. Serena stepped forward, every eye following her as if the room itself bent to her gravity. She walked to the stage, her heels clicking like a countdown, and stood beside Adrian without flinching. The cameras erupted again, desperate to catch the collision of predator and prey. Except it was Adrian who looked hunted. Serena took the microphone with calm precaution. "Ision." Her voice was steady, soft enough to demand silence. "Yes," she said simply. "I did purchase those shares. Not to destroy you, Adrian. To protect myself. I knew what you were hiding. I knew about the accounts, the bribes, the lies, and I knew that one day you would try to erase me. So I prepared. Women like me have to prepare, because men like you believe betrayal is power, when in truth, power is preparation." She reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive. "And since you enjoy showing documents to an audience, allow me to share mine." The screen behind them flickered, and suddenly, emails, contracts, and voice recordings filled the air. Proof of Adrian's corruption in his own words. Proof of his collusion with city officials, his offshore transfers, even whispers of threats made to silence those who questioned him. The crowd erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Investors stormed out, phones pressed to their ears. Adrian stood frozen, his so-called revelation turned into a mirror reflecting his own sins. Serena leaned close enough that only he could hear. Her smile was faint, dangerous, the same one that had haunted him since the night of the gala. "Checkmate, Adrian. You tried to play God, but all you ever were was a man too arrogant to see the queen across the board." By nightfall, Adrian's face filled every screen, not as a savior, but as a criminal. And Serena's calm declaration echoed through the city like prophecy. Preparation had outlasted arrogance, and the empire he thought eternal now crumbled in the span of a single smile. The storm broke on Adrian Blackwell's life with the force of a hurricane. In the days after Serena's public reveal, his empire collapsed faster than even his enemies imagined. Banks froze his accounts. Government investigators stormed his offices, hauling away boxes of files. His board resigned in shame, distancing themselves from the man they once worshipped. And Vivian, the mistress who had been the jewel on his arm, abandoned him the moment the photographers turned their backs, leaving a seed angle note that read, "I cannot go down with you." Adrian sat in his penthouse alone, the silence so heavy it felt alive. Once he had commanded a city with his name. Now his phones rang only with threats from creditors and summons from courts. He replayed Serena's smile in his mind, the calm precision of her voice as she dismantled him in front of the world. That smile had been his undoing from the beginning. Meanwhile, Serena walked into the courtroom that would decide Adrian's fate, not as a victim, not even as his ex-wife, but as a witness holding the final blade. The gallery was packed with reporters, investors, and curious onlookers hungry to watch the end of a fallen king. Adrian entered in a tailored suit that did nothing to hide the exhaustion etched into his face. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a man cornered by truth. The prosecutor laid out the case with surgical precision: fraud, bribery, tax evasion, destruction of evidence. Each charge built upon the last until the weight became unbearable. But it was Serena's testimony that sealed his fate. She rose slowly, her posture unyielding, and spoke not of vengeance, but of truth. She described years of secrets she had silently collected, the accounts she traced, the evidence she preserved, while Adrian mocked her as nothing more than decoration on his arm. When she finished, she looked directly at him, her voice carrying like a verdict. "You tried to replace me in public with your mistress, Adrian. But what you never understood is that you cannot replace truth. You cannot erase preparation. You cannot silence a woman who knows her worth." The room held its breath. Adrian's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with hatred and regret, but he had no words left to fight her. Then Serena revealed the final twist. She handed the court sealed documents, proof that Adrian had been secretly plotting to transfer his remaining wealth into Vivian's name weeks before the gala. He was planning to discard her too, Serena told the judge. The same way he tried to discard me. Every relationship to him was a transaction, every person a pawn, and pawns are expendable. Gasps filled the chamber. The betrayal cut deeper than fraud or bribery. Even Vivian, watching from the gallery in designer black, covered her face and fled. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. Adrian Blackwell was sentenced to 25 years without parole. His name, once written in neon across skyscrapers, now etched in the records of criminals. As officers led him away in handcuffs, Adrian turned back, his voice raw, desperate. "Serena, was it always about revenge?" Serena rose, her eyes unflinching. "No, Adrian, it was always about justice. Revenge ends with your downfall. Justice begins with rebuilding what you destroyed." Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed as Serena emerged. She did not gloat, did not raise her voice. She simply smiled, the same quiet, dangerous smile that had begun it all, and the world finally understood. She had never been broken. She had been waiting. And now, with Adrian gone and his empire turned to ashes, it was her turn to build something stronger. The wife he tried to erase had become the legacy he could never escape.